This is part 3 of the fall of feudalism, and we are going to finish the lecture out, which means that you should, by the time this is over, have all your blanks filled in. If you don't have the blanks filled in, then you need to find the information on your own, or you can send me an email and I can direct you where you can get any missing information that you have. So we're looking at the final causes of the fall of feudalism. We have talked about schisms before. Here, the Great Schism, the division between the French Catholics and the Italian Catholics. So this is geographical, right? You'll see the picture in the bottom right-hand corner. We have these two popes, one from Italy, one from France, and they're struggling over which one was going to be the official pope of the Catholic Church. The Italians preferred a pope that was Italian, and they tried to influence the cardinals, who are the ones who decide who the pope is, going to be. And so that's where Pope Urban VI came from, through the kind of intimidation, or at least the suggestion of Italians influencing the cardinals. The French cardinals were upset about this bullied Italian pope, so they just said, fine, you guys picked an Italian one, we're going to pick a French one, and it split Europe down the middle. The French allies liked the French pope, but England and Italy preferred the pope that was in Rome, not the one that was in Avignon, which is in France. That's where they set up the French pope, because you can't have the French pope and the Italian pope living in the same house. So the French pope lived in Avignon, the Italian pope lived in Rome, and England supported Italy because primarily England and France are enemies. They've actually fought more wars against each other than any other two countries in history, and they were on the same side in World War I and World War II, so that's definitely saying something. So what happens with the schism? Each one said negative things about the other, and eventually they claimed that the other was the Antichrist. It's a biblical reference. It has to do with the revolution of final judgment of Christians, and so it's not a good thing. Eventually, some peace was established. They met in Switzerland and decided to end the schism in 1417. They brought everybody back together by picking a third pope. So each one decided, look, this is a stalemate. I'm never going to accept you. You're never going to accept me. In order for Catholicism to stay united, we need to pick a third neutral party. And so they picked a new pope, so that everybody that was involved would be, if not happy, they wouldn't be upset. I'm going to slow down just a little bit. I know I've been speaking kind of quickly, so I'm going to slow down a little bit. That way you won't have to pause the video quite so much. Alright, so part of the issue, and this connects also to the Black Plague. We saw that at the end of the Black Plague, that many people left the church because they saw that it didn't matter if you were religious or not, you still could get the plague. They saw people who they knew were vile and despicable people get the plague, and people who they knew were spiritual and holy got the plague, and they knew that there were people who were vile and horrible who did not get the plague. So a lot of people lost their faith in the church and started to see the church as not being the primary influence in their life. It wasn't as important to them. The schism just made that even worse, right? The church lost a ton of political power because of this infighting. It was not the unified force that it had been prior to that. And in our constant conversation about who has more power, the Pope or the King, the Pope no longer outweighed the state. The Pope was no longer superior to the King or to kings in influence. And they lost a lot of their spiritual authority. It used to be they were the only voice about Christianity. Now some people were starting to say, look, not everything they say sounds right. we should listen to some other people. There might be other people outside the church that have a sense of what's going on, or maybe understand religion and Christianity or God better. So the schism was kind of the last kick off the king of the mountain for the church, right? They had been the top primary force, and then after the plague and after the schism, the church was really weakened. What we have here is the Summa Theologica. So it is, the title of the book is actually a summary of theology. So with the loss of authority of the church, the culture needed someone to come along to say, this is what Christianity is really about. That's what this book is. Written by St. Thomas Aquinas. He says that there are two kinds of truth. There are two ways to know things. There are things that you know through reason, and there are things that you know through faith. Right? So truth that you know through reason would be like scientific, and truth that you know through faith would be religious. And he's saying that there is not one way to know everything. And the book, if you get a chance to read it, the book does a really good job of phrasing some common thoughts about religion. Does a good job of kind of parsing it down, and is seen as a very wise and brilliantly written text. Another point that Aquinas makes in Summa Theologica is that those two truths, the truth of faith and the truth of reason, cannot oppose each other, that they will always be in line. Something that is true all the time. Whether you discover that truth through faith or discover that truth through reason, they cannot contradict each other. He did a really good job of pulling in other people's thoughts, collecting that information, and trying to sort out, and he struggled with sorting out spiritual truths. And the end result was that he created kind of a mathematical proof for religion. How do we know what is true? How do we know what is meant by text in the Bible, outside of the Bible, those sorts of things? And so reading it is akin to having your mind trained to think spiritually, just like if you work through a math book, it would be training your mind to think mathematically. All right, another event at the end of the Middle Ages that launches us into the Renaissance is the 100 Years' War. So the 100 Years' War started in 1337, ended in 1453, which means it's longer than 100 years. I mentioned earlier that the French and the English were enemies, that they had fought more wars against each other than any other two countries, and they were on the same side in World War I and World War II. This is one of those conflicts where we have the French fighting the English. One of the things that makes the 100 Years' War remarkable is that it is the point in time when we see the most implementation of a new weapon. So bows and arrows have been around for a long time, but the longbow, which is engineered a little differently than a regular bow, right? A regular bow is a straight rod, it's a straight shaft that you bend. So a longbow actually has a recurve on it. A regular bow can only be as big, and the force for the regular bow can only be as big as the archer is tall. You can't pull a bow that is taller than you. So one of the things that makes a longbow unique is that it's recurved. It's actually bent in the opposite direction. So you can get more force from the bow and it's still smaller. Gives you more mobility. You can fire it from horseback. You can, carry it around more. You can be more maneuverable with a longbow. This new weapon just totally wipes out the French cavalry in two specific battles, at Crécy and in Agincourt. And the cavalry was, just like tanks today, cavalry at the time was what influenced battles the most. Infantry held the ground, cavalry comes in and wins the war or the battle. Another important historical event during this period of time is the rise of Joan of Arc. She definitely has a role that she plays in the Hundred Years' War. She was seen as a very religious person. She was told that she would save France from the English, and became in many ways kind of a mascot for the French in the war. She pretended to be just a regular male soldier. She showed up at specific points in time, at crucial points in time in the battle, and led the soldiers to victory. And it was only later that it was discovered that she was a woman, right? And so when questioned, she said that her saints told her this is what she should do. She was sent to talk to the King of France to kind of see what was going on. He wanted to know what was going on. So when she showed up in court, he tried to trick her, and he hid in the crowd and put another person up on the throne. When she walked in, the idea was that she would walk up to this person who wasn't the king and introduce herself, and ha ha ha, it was going to be a great joke. But according to history, when she came in, she walked towards the throne and then turned and walked directly to him, a person she had never seen before, and said, introduced herself and said, you're the king, and all of that. And the point was that the spirits, God, guided her so that she wouldn't be seen foolish, and it was a way to prove to the king that she had God's blessing. And so she was able to persuade the king and the troops to fight in battles where other people were not successful of doing that. Later in the war, she was captured, and she was condemned to death, executed by the English. Right? The English captured her. They said that she was a heretic, and we've talked about heresy already. But what they really convicted her for was dressing as a man, because she put on armor and she pretended to be a man. The Old Testament says that that is something that you get executed for. So she became a martyr for France, and eventually led to a victory for France in the 100 Years' War. That victory was also, in part, supported by another weapon that we've already talked about a little bit, but wasn't really prominent in Europe until now. And that's the cannon. So we've talked a little bit about cannons already. I've explained to you how they work. That we have gunpowder now that is improved gunpowder that makes cannons more lethal, that makes them more effective, and France is able to maximize the use of the cannon in battle against the English and establish a new strong monarchy and put France back together. It had been kind of piecemealed during this period of time leading up to the 100 Years' War. It had been kind of broken apart and controlled by different places, and so the cannon helped reunify France. Things are not so great in England because of the war and because of the devastation that was brought on by the war. They lost a lot of the people who would normally do the work, and so their economy drops. Right? Just like if we have a huge war here, and you have a lot of people who go and they fight and they die and they don't come back, so there's an absence of people. There's a lack of workers. At the same time, England is also going through a different conflict, a civil conflict called the War of Roses, which is a battle for control over the country. result, kind of like in France, is a new, stronger monarchy. It established rules, kind of like the Magna Carta did. It established rules as far as nobles are no longer allowed to have their own armies, only the king can have the army. And it created a new era of cooperation between the king and the middle class. So, because the king didn't have his boot on the neck of the middle class quite as much, they supported him more. So the monarchy lasted longer, and in general, politics and the economy were better. So this is where we end the Middle Ages. We've had some fairly devastating events like the 100 Years' War and the Black Plague. We've had some new inventions and innovations like the longbow and the cannon. We have some changes in religion with the Great Schism, the loss of political power by the church, the writing of the Summa Theologica, and we have these two new kingdoms strongly rebuilt for England and France, and that sets the stage for the Renaissance, which is what we're going to go to next in Europe.